Alert, alert, this is a Doomcock News alert. Alert, alert, this is a Doomcock News alert.
It's a very odd feeling to see the world going crazy over news that you've known for literally a year. Bob Iger is about to publish his memoir entitled The Ride of a Lifetime: Lessons Learned from 15 Years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company. And excerpts from this memoir have made their way into various news outlets already due to their incendiary revelations that George Lucas felt betrayed by Disney and by Kathleen Kennedy and is not a fan of what Disney has done to Star Wars. While it is very interesting to read Iger's behind-the-scenes account of how George Lucas reacted to the production process leading up to The Force Awakens, my reaction on reading these excited headlines was, no duh. It has been clear to me for a very long time that Lucas was not a fan of the sequel trilogy. Why? Two key pieces of information were incredibly damning and served as proof in my mind that Lucas was unhappy with how Disney was betraying his legacy. Firstly, Mark Hamill in an interview confirmed that he and George Lucas speak all the time, and when they do, they discuss the current Star Wars movies. When Hamill declined to reveal the contents of those conversations and refused to indicate in any way what Lucas thought of the new movies, that silence was a howl of protest. One need only consider that there would be no downside whatsoever for Mark Hamill to reveal to the world that George Lucas loves the new Star Wars movies and supports them. Everyone associated with productions these days does that automatically, no matter what they actually think. The fact that Hamill would not do that and was coy on the point was a solid confirmation in my mind that he and Lucas were getting together for some good old-fashioned Star Wars bashing. Hamill himself, before he was silenced by his corporate overlords, who no doubt reminded him of certain contractual obligations to be positive, was quite clear that he was dismayed by how Luke was treated in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, how he strenuously disagreed with every single decision Rian Johnson made regarding Luke Skywalker, and so his revelation that he and George Lucas speak frequently about Star Wars and his subsequent refusal to elaborate was yet another subtle shot at Disney Star Wars and further indication that they both felt betrayed by the sequel trilogy. But the second indication that Lucas felt betrayed by Disney Star Wars came directly from Lucas's own mouth when he compared selling Star Wars to Disney to selling your child to white slavers. Knowing what we know now about how Disney treated George Lucas, it's clear this was no joke, no mere slip of the lip. George Lucas meant exactly what he said, that he had turned over his legacy to Disney and they had tricked it out, had turned it out on the metaphorical streets to hustle for money in the most degrading of ways. George Lucas had been lied to. He thought he was selling his child to a company that would love it and raise it right, and instead they treated it with neglect, if not outright hostility, warping it into something twisted and unrecognizable. I've known for at least a year that George Lucas hated Disney Star Wars. Now, thanks to Bob Iger's memoir, I know exactly why. Here are Iger's own words regarding the steps that led to the betrayal of George Lucas. At some point in the process, George told me that he had completed outlines for 3 new movies. He agreed to send us 3 copies of the outlines, one for me, one for Alan Braverman, and one for Alan Horn, who'd just been hired to run our studio. Alan Horn and I read George's outlines and decided we needed to buy them, though we made clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he laid out. In other words, they bought him off. They just wanted to go ahead and buy those things and then bury them in the deepest hole that they could find. Iger states further, he knew that I was going to stand firm on the question of creative control, but it wasn't an easy thing for him to accept. And so he reluctantly agreed to be available to consult with us at our request. I promised that we would be open to his ideas. This was not a hard promise to make. Of course we would be open to George Lucas's ideas, but like the outlines, we would be under no obligation. So in other words, they listened to him, They bought his stories. They went ahead and put him under contract to be consulting with them, and then proceeded to ignore him, to discard his ideas, and to run roughshod over George Lucas and Star Wars. Iger set up a meeting between Lucas, Michael Arndt, and Kathleen Kennedy at Skywalker Ranch to talk about their ideas for the new film, The Force Awakens in this case. And as they spoke, Iger reveals, quote, George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him that we weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiations. The truth was, Kathy, J.J. Abrams, Alan, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now, but I could have handled it better. I should have prepared him for the meeting with JJ and Michael and told him about our conversations, that he felt it was better to go in another direction. I could have talked through this with him and possibly avoided angering him by not surprising him. Now, in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed. And while this whole process would never have been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessarily rocky start. My friends, if you ever want to see a visual representation of betrayal, track down on YouTube the interview with Kathleen Kennedy and George Lucas when George was handing the reins of Lucasfilm over to Kathleen. She promised to look over his vision of Star Wars, to shepherd it in good faith, to respect his characters. In other words, she lied to the man's face. And that lie was made manifest by Bob Iger and Disney as they moved forward, betraying everything that George Lucas stood for, betraying Star Wars, and betraying all of us along the way. Only too late did George Lucas realize the error he had made in selling his baby to the dark side. So now we know, from Iger's own words, that George Lucas is under contractual obligation to consult with them. I would assume that he is also under some kind of obligation to support Star Wars. That's why when we see George Lucas at the opening of Galaxy's Edge, or we see him trotted out to other Star Wars events and premieres, that he has a smile on his face and keeps his mouth shut, because not even George Lucas can stand up to the omnipresent, omnivorous mouse. The revelation that George Lucas is unhappy with Disney's Star Wars is no revelation to me. All we know now are the specifics as to why he felt so betrayed. And the only thing that I can think to say about this horrific treatment of George Lucas and Star Wars and the fans, George Lucas is one of us now. George Lucas knows the pain of seeing Star Wars go bad. For some of us, it began with the prequel trilogy. For others, we held out until the sequel trilogy. But regardless, George Lucas now fully understands the pain of the fans. George Lucas now is one of us. And I would like to say to the man himself, George Lucas, welcome to the Fandom Menace. From the center of the earth, this is Dictor Van Doomcock bidding you all, my friends, stay angry.
Ha 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 ha.